Hello, and welcome to our study in the Gospel of Luke. Today we're going to be in Luke chapter 22. So if you want to get your Bibles turned over to that chapter, we'll be in verse 31 of Luke 22. We are on lesson 21 in our workbooks, and this is a continuing study that we've been doing now for several weeks, months actually, in the Gospel. We are nearing the end of our study. We are in chapter 22, and as you know, there's 24 chapters. We are now in the last final day or two of Christ's life on the earth. So it is a very difficult time for Jesus as well as for his disciples. His disciples still being in a great state of confusion and not really going to be fully prepared for what's going to happen, even though Christ has tried his very best to prepare them. But so much of their understanding won't be complete until after Christ's ascension, and then they receive the Holy Spirit, which of course gives them a complete understanding. So for now, Jesus is just trying to do his best to give them information and instruction that they will be able to use later. So we're opening up on page, I want to look at page 125 in our workbooks to start with, because our author from time to time lists in chronological order, the events that we are studying and how many other events that did occur, but the Gospel of Luke does not record. So we have to go to the other three gospel writers sometimes to fill in those gaps of events and information. So if you look there at the top of page 125 in your workbook, he lists a number of events that are going to take place in the next 24 hours. Now remember that the Jewish day starts at sundown. So the events that are listed start at sundown on Thursday night, which to them is the beginning of their Friday, where they are eating the Passover meal, and he is instituting the Lord's Supper. That begins that time. Then Jesus, again, number 2 states that Jesus reveals that Judas will betray him. We talked about that a little bit last lesson, where they all ask one another, is it I, is it me, who is it? Because up until this time, I don't know that many of the disciples were aware that this was going to happen. And Judas now finds out that Jesus is fully aware of what's going to happen. Then there's contention that arises among the apostles as to who is the greatest. And that's something we also covered in last week's lesson. Then we have Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, which Luke does not record. That's only recorded in the Gospel of John in chapter 13. But that event follows the institution of the Lord's Supper. So if you can remember to keep those events in order, it helps us to understand the purpose and the timing of some of these things. Then we have Jesus predicting Peter's denial. That's going to be in today's lesson. And then Jesus assures the apostles that they're going to have the Comforter who will come, and he will help them with what's going to happen. That's also only recorded in the book of John, chapters 14 through 16, where Jesus has a very long conversation, the very last long conversation he is going to have with his disciples. Judas has already departed the group at this time. As soon as he found out Jesus was aware of his betrayal, he leaves the group, and that leaves just the 11 remaining apostles that are with Jesus at this time. Then in chapter 17 of John, one of the more beautiful prayers that Jesus prays is recorded there for us, where Jesus is praying on the behalf of the apostles to his Father. So if you have not read that chapter recently, I really suggest and encourage you to do so. It is a beautiful chapter where Jesus prays to the Father for what his apostles are going to be facing in the next few days. Then in number 8 on our list, we have the prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane that follows right after his prediction of Peter's denial. And then the betrayal and arrest of Jesus happens following his prayer in the garden. That brings us then to the end of lesson 21, which is what we'll be covering in this presentation. In the next presentation, we follow on number 10 down through the end there, where we have the events of his trial, his arrest, Peter denying the Lord 3 times, and then the things that the Jewish leaders do in the next 24 hours that are going to be quite astounding, since they break many of their Jewish laws to do so. So when you get a chance, read through this list and refer back to it as we get into our study in the next few chapters. All right, we're going to start then with our questions on page 130, which begins with the reading that we have in Luke chapter 22, verse 31, where Jesus is predicting the denial that Peter is going to do of the Lord, that he even knows the Lord. Of course, at this point in time, Peter is completely convinced that he would never do such a thing. And Jesus is trying to help him to understand what's going to happen. So in verse 31, he says, "Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." So he tells him, question 1 asks, what did Satan want to do with Simon? He wants to sift him as wheat, which in their day, the sifting of wheat was a very common practice. They would bring the wheat, they would put them through these sifters or sieve-like round things, and they would throw the grains of wheat up in the air, and the chaff would blow away and separate from the good grain. That was the process they used. And then that grain would be taken and ground into flour. Well, using it metaphorically here, Jesus is trying to describe to Peter that he's going to be tested by Satan to see if he would remain faithful. If he remained faithful through this trial, he would come out stronger at the end, and Jesus is going to have prayed for him. This shows the immense care that Jesus had for these men that were his apostles. He's going to pray that their faith not fail, and it says, when you have returned to me. He already knew that once Peter did go through the denial process, that he would not abandon Christ. He would return to him. He would remain faithful and devoted. And when he did, he was going to be stronger, and he would then be able to strengthen his brethren because of the trial that he had gone through. And if you think about it, this is how trials and tribulations are to work in our lives as well. When we experience trials and failures, and we get through them with the help of God, and we remain faithful, it will strengthen our faith. It will make us stronger and better able to face the next trial and failure that happens. So there is a purpose, we know that from scripture, for trials, and this is what's going to happen to Peter in the next few hours. But think for just a moment, if Satan had been successful in sifting Peter to the point where he did abandon Christ and what Christ wanted him to do, think of the effect that would have had on the Great Commission. Because Peter was one of the most reliable apostles. He goes out and preaches a lot of places. So do the other apostles as well. But we know from the book of Acts that Peter's very active in spreading the gospel, and he remains tremendously loyal to the cause and to the mission. But Satan is always available to tempt us, to seek us at our weakest points, and to try to get us to abandon Christ. And Peter does that for a few moments in time, maybe an hour, hour and a half. And then he realizes what he has done and he repents. But Jesus gives encouragement to Peter here, letting him know that he will be praying for them, as well as all of the other apostles from the chapter John 17 that I just mentioned. He prays for all of his apostles, not just Peter. He wanted Peter to be able to return from this challenge stronger and better able to help his brethren. Now, in verse 33, we see Peter's response to this prediction that Jesus has made. Question 2 asks, what did Jesus say he would pray for on behalf of Simon? We've already talked about that his faith would not fail and he would return and strengthen his brethren. Question 3 asks, what did Peter affirm he would do before denying the Lord? He says in verse 33, but he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. He is proclaiming here, I'm sure, quite boldly and very strongly that I am ready to go to prison or to death with you. That's the conviction that Peter had, that he was not in any way, shape, or form going to deny Christ, even though Christ tells him it's going to happen. He was totally serious when he made this statement in verse 33. But once we give in to the traps of Satan, we end up doing things we never thought possible. And that's what happens to Peter here. The crowing of the rooster in verse 34, I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny me 3 times that you know me. Seemed impossible to Peter at this point that would ever happen, because in his mind, he was convicted and devoted to Christ and to the work. But the crowing of the rooster will be that sign that when Peter hears it, he will remember what the Lord said, and it will bring him to a state of complete sorrow, humbleness, and regret. And that's what happens to us when we do things we didn't think were even possible for us to do, that we realize the shame and guilt and regret that we feel on allowing ourselves to weaken to the point that we gave in to the temptation of Satan. So don't think you are invincible in this way either, because none of us are. We can all have those weaknesses, those moments of doubt, moments of fear, where Satan will tempt us to do things we never thought possible. And we know that Peter is going to experience a great deal of fear, as will the other apostles. They're going to have a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty and doubt as to what is happening. And so it makes them vulnerable then for Satan's temptations. All right, in the next verses then, starting in verse 35, Jesus wants his disciples to prepare for the coming opposition. Up to this point, most of the opposition has been focused on Jesus. The apostles had not really faced any personal threats or persecution, but most of it was directed towards Jesus. But that is going to change with the crucifixion and with the arrest. So Jesus wants them to be prepared. When he sent them out on what we call the limited commission, where he sends them out into the cities of Israel to spread the gospel, they were not to take very many things along with them, because they were going to be among their own brethren. They were going to be in cities that they were familiar with. But coming up on the Great Commission, which they were then going to go out into all the world, into foreign lands, they were going to have to carry supplies with them. So he tells them in verse 36, to take a money bag, to take a knapsack, which would have supplies in it, traveling supplies. And if anyone had a sword, they were to sell their garment and buy one. They were to be prepared, because their opposition was going to then be focused on them. They were going to be faced with some personal threats and mistreatment, and Jesus wants them to be prepared. We'll talk later about the purpose of the sword that he wants them to have with them, but they were to take money, they were to take supplies, they were to be ready to defend themselves if needed. They were not to seek out a way to use the sword. They were to seek out to harm anyone, but to use it for protection when traveling, etc. Just because they were going to be traveling on a lot of the different roads and areas in the land, and many of them, there were robbers that waited by the wayside for people traveling by, and they would attack them. So there was a purpose for being able to defend themselves, but as I said, they were not to seek times to use the sword in violence. All right, next question, number 4 asks, what was written in the scriptures that must yet be accomplished? That comes in verse 37, where he says, for I say to you that this which is written again must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So these events that are going to be taking place in just a few hours were prophesied in Scripture. They must take place. It was important that this happened to Jesus the way that it had been prophesied, and that then there would be an end to the persecution against Jesus once he was dead, of course. But the apostles were then going to be faced with that persecution. And so we know that being nailed on the cross, and then he had a criminal on each side of him who had truly broken the law and were deserving of that kind of punishment. It showed the degree of hatred and evil that these leaders were going to demonstrate towards Jesus, because he was going to be numbered among criminals and treated as a criminal, which was going to be very difficult for the apostles to stand by and watch. And they were going to be very confused as to why all of this was happening, because they knew Jesus had not committed a crime. So he wants to, in this way, to let them know this is fulfillment of prophecy. It has to occur the way that it's going to occur, and be prepared for that. They tell him in verse 38 that they do have 2 swords among them, and Jesus tells them it is enough. They don't need to each have one. They don't need to prepare like they're going into warfare, that kind of warfare anyway. But that the 2 swords that they had accumulated would be sufficient. All right, so Jesus quotes here in verse 37 from Isaiah 53, verse 12. This was a prophecy, as I said, that there was going to be a great deal of hatred demonstrated toward Jesus. Now we find Jesus coming out of where he had been with the apostles in the upper room where they had eaten the Passover. They're now going to take a walk across the brook Kidron and into the Garden of Gethsemane, which was located at Mount of Olives, which was just outside the city of Jerusalem. So they were going to leave the enclosure wall area of Jerusalem, walk across the brook, and go into the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus often went here to find solace and quiet away from the people. I'm sure he had a regular practice of going here when he was in the area, and he would use it as a time to go to prayer with his Father. His 11 disciples go with him. Remember, Judas is no longer in the group. And it tells us in John chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, that Judas knew of this place too, knew the area in the garden where Jesus went with his disciples. So he knows this is a common place that Jesus visited when they were in the Jerusalem area, which makes Judas the perfect person for the chief priests and rulers to use, since he knew about the goings and comings of Jesus and the disciples. So he goes into the garden, and he's going to spend some time in prayer. He takes all 11 of his disciples with him into the garden, but in Mark chapter 14, verse 33, it tells us that Peter, James, and John, the four of them, then walked away from the larger group of disciples, and they went further away into a very quiet area. I'm sure there was many olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane, and so they went off by themselves. He sets the three disciples and says to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdraws from them, verse 41, about a stone's throw away, and he kneels down and he prays. So he's asked his disciples to pray that they not be tempted into doing something. And of the other accounts of the Garden of Gethsemane, he also tells them to keep watch because he knew the group to arrest him would be coming soon. So he's going to go at some distance where he's alone, and he's going to pray. He prays that whatever he's about to face, verse 42, he makes the request, and that's question 5. What was the request of Jesus to God? Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. This cup referring to the suffering, the anguish that he was getting ready to suffer. Jesus, being the Son of God, was fully aware of what he was going to have to go through. Not only the crucifixion, but the trial, the beatings, the abuse that he was going to have to suffer as a prisoner. And then the eventual crucifixion, which was terribly painful. He knew that suffering was something he had to do, but he certainly was not anxious for him to have to do it. He also was going to take upon him the sins of the world, which was going to cause him great sorrow and anguish as well. So he prays this prayer, understanding he was willing to carry out the Father's will, but knew that it was going to be very, very hard for him. We see the humanity of Jesus in this prayer. We often forget that he was also a man. He suffered human things just like you and I do. And that is why it's important for us to, sorry, I got something on my screen, for us to remember that when we read about this prayer, that he is praying as any of us would. If I don't have to go through this suffering, Lord, if it be your will that I be able to not have to do it, then that's what he wanted. But we do know that the Lord, or God the Father, was going to require him to do this. He prays this prayer 3 separate times. Luke doesn't tell us that, but the other gospel accounts do in Matthew and Mark, where he goes 3 different times, prays the prayer, comes back to where the 3 disciples are waiting and finds them sleeping, which I'm sure was a little bit of a discouragement for him. But we have to remember this took place in the middle of the night. It's very, very late or early in the morning. So the disciples would have been physically weary and exhausted. It tells us in verse 43 that an angel was sent by God. That's question 7. Let's do question 6 first. How was the agony of Jesus described? That's in verse 44, that he was in agony, physical, emotional, and mental agony. And he prayed more earnestly, more fervently. And then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground, indicating the intensity in which this suffering and agony that he was going through brought upon his physical body and his mental health as well. Then it says in verse 43, which is question 7, how did God help Jesus in this hour of suffering? An angel appears to him from heaven, and this angel strengthened Jesus. God the Father heard the prayer. He is going to, of course, his will is going to be carried out, and he sends Jesus an angel to give him what he needs to endure what's going to happen to Jesus physically and mentally. So the angel comes, he strengthens Jesus. This angel came directly from God the Father, which indicates to us that the Lord God the Father cares about us to the degree that we will get what we need to go through difficulties, trials, and tribulations. So we are, then Jesus, as I said, prays 3 times. He comes back after each prayer, finds the disciples sleeping, wakes them up, asks them, "Why are you sleeping? Couldn't you keep watch for just a little while for me?" And then he would go back and repeat the prayer, come back and still find them sleeping. He does this 3 times. Apostles were apparently very physically exhausted, and they didn't know what was getting ready to happen. If they had, they would have definitely stayed awake and watched, but they were still not totally understanding what was coming. So they were weary, they slept. The 3rd time, when he comes back and finds them sleeping, he tells them to rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. It's now time to get up and get ready because something is getting ready to happen. They needed to be eyewitnesses of what was going to happen so they could teach others about it, and that they could then write about it, as some of these apostles wrote books of the Bible. So it was important that they be awake and present at what was going to happen. When he wakes the disciples up, it's very, while he's still speaking, it says in verse 47 that Judas arrives with his entourage, if you want to call it that. He comes with a detachment of soldiers. He comes with some of the chief priests and leaders of the people. Luke doesn't give us a full description of who was in this company, but if you go to one of the other, John chapter 18 gives you a full list of who came with him: troops, officers, priests, Pharisees, and elders, it says. They were carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons, swords, clubs, whatever was needed, apparently anticipating a difficult arrest. They came prepared just in case there was some, resistance to the arrest. We know that it's a charge. If you try to resist being arrested, you get charged with that as well as whatever the other crime is. So they were expecting some kind of response, maybe from the apostles. They came prepared because they are not going to fail this time. They had failed many other times to arrest Jesus or grab him or whatever you want to call it, and he had escaped from them because it wasn't his time yet. So this time it's going to be not a difficult arrest. Jesus will willingly go with them. He will submit to what they want to do because it is his Father's will that he do so. So they come prepared. Judas, walks up to Jesus and gives him a kiss. That was the sign or signal where he would identify Jesus to anyone in that company who did not know him on sight. Perhaps the soldiers did not know who Jesus was on sight. They were unfamiliar with who he was. Maybe some of the leaders were as well. So the kiss was to identify that this was the man they were to arrest. So question 8 asks, with what question did Jesus accuse Judas? We see that in verse 48. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" I mean, isn't that kind of the height of hypocrisy here? A kiss is something you do in friendship to show your love and care and concern for that individual. And here he's using it in an evil way by kissing him. So they were, it was just the misuse of this. And Jesus asks him, "Why are you doing this? Think about what you're doing. You're betraying the Son of Man, and you're using a kiss, a sign of friendship." He had traveled with this man for 3 years. They were good friends, I'm sure. And he used it in a way that none of us should ever use a kiss. So he then is identified as the one to be arrested. And we know that the apostles were all gathered around when this happened. They were watching. And one of them, it says in verse 50, takes out his sword and cuts off the the servant of the high priest, cuts off his right ear, completely severs it, bam. And there you have it. It was a terrible wound, I'm sure, terribly painful. And if we turn to one of the other gospels, we find out that it was Peter. John 18, verse 10 tells us it was Peter who drew his sword and struck the high servant priest's ear and cut it off. John even tells you the name of this man because, as we know, John was known by the high priest. He was known by these people and he knew them, so he knows this man's name. Jesus tells him to put the sword away. In a couple of other of the accounts, he tells the group that's there, if I need to be rescued, if I need to avoid being arrested, I can call 12 legions of angels to come to my defense, if that's what Jesus needed. But he had to allow this to happen to fulfill his Father's will. The apostles, that was a human instinctive reaction when you see a loved one being mistreated or arrested unlawfully. Wouldn't you jump in and try to help in some way? And that's what we see Peter doing. Jesus takes the ear that had been severed and he heals it. Whether he restored a brand new ear or whether he takes the ear and reattaches it through a miraculous touch, all it says is he touched his ear and he healed it. So the servant's hearing was restored, the ear was restored. This is the only record we have of Jesus performing this kind of miracle where he heals a flesh wound. Most of the miracles Jesus performed were to do with diseases, leprosy, blindness, lameness, that kind of thing. Here, actually heals a flesh wound. This would have been a serious wound. Perhaps no way they would have known how to reattach it in their day because of medical knowledge being limited. But Jesus heals the man right then and there on the spot, in a moment, in an instant. He's able to restore the man's ear. And he says in verse 51, permit even this, trying to get his disciples to understand, you don't need to defend me and rescue me. This is not the time for that kind of thing. So he looks at the group that's surrounding him, and they brought all these weapons. And Jesus asks them some very interesting questions here. He says, I was with you daily in the temple. You saw me. I was there, easily found, easily seen, but you did not try to seize me there. And he's asking them, so why have you chosen this particular place and time? Well, Jesus already knew the answer, of course. It was because they had to do it away from the people. They had to do it in the middle of the night so that it would be known by only a few people. He asks in verse 52, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? I mean, who did you think you were getting ready to arrest? A vicious criminal who was going to resist the arrest and fight back? Because they came prepared for that. At least that's what it looked like. So Jesus is asking them, what in the world did you expect? Jesus willingly goes with them. They bound him, I'm assuming with rope or chains, and they're going to lead him away out of the garden, and they're going to go back into the city of Jerusalem. As far as we know, Peter suffered no consequences for what he did. He could have himself been arrested or perhaps killed for what he did, but he is not. We see this here, that none of Jesus's disciples suffered any harm. That was part of the promise that the Lord had, that God the Father had given Jesus about his disciples. that he would not lose any of them except the son of perdition, which of course was referring to Judas. And that's in John chapter 17 and verse 12, if you want to look that up, or John tells us that. In the prayer that Jesus prays, he says to God the Father, that I have kept all of my disciples that you've given me. I have not lost any of them except for the son of perdition, which was part of the fulfillment of prophecy. So Peter suffers no consequences here. He's not arrested himself. It shows us the boldness, impetuousness of Peter and how he truly did mean what he said earlier when he said he was ready to go to prison and to death with the Lord, because he's defending him here with a weapon. So he again, a normal human reaction when one of your loved ones, someone you care deeply about, is being arrested and taken away. All right, we do know from Mark and Matthew in their accounts, Mark 14 and Matthew 26, where this same account is given, that Peter and John do follow the group that's taking Jesus at a distance. So they're not in the circle of people that are right around Jesus, but they are close by. The rest of the apostles, it tells us they fled, they left, they ran out of fear of being arrested, out of misunderstanding of what was happening. This was something that would have surprised them, something they had not expected to happen. And when you come, excuse me, with this large group with you, soldiers with weapons, and it would have been very ominous. It would have been very intimidating to be in this group of people and to see Christ, who they thought could overcome anyone, being arrested and led away as a common criminal. It struck fear and confusion in the minds of these disciples. They did not know what it was they were supposed to do. The fleeing of the scene was also a fulfillment of prophecy, where it was prophesied that they would all forsake him in some way or form. We already know that Judas did that. Peter and John follow at a distance, only probably to see what was going to happen, but they didn't get involved in the trial or in talking or defending. As far as we know, they didn't have any conversation with any of the officials, because they had to be careful that they themselves didn't get involved in the arrest. So that's where this lesson leaves us at the end of verse 53. He says at the end of verse 53 that the reason this arrest was happening is because it was their hour. But this is your hour, meaning this is the time that God wanted me to be arrested. The other times they tried, failed, because it wasn't when it was supposed to happen. God being the one in control of everything, this was going to happen when the time came for it to happen. And then he mentions the power of darkness here. We know that most crimes are permitted in the dark at night. We know that the power of darkness is also referring to the fact that Satan is involved in what's happening here. Satan having put these ideas into the mind of Judas, as well as the officials, that they were to be what they're doing. They're exactly carrying out the will of God, even though they have no idea they are fulfilling scripture or that they are carrying out the will of God. They think they're just doing something that they feel compelled to do because they feel threatened by Jesus's presence among them. They fear for their position with the people. They fear that the Roman government will intervene and they will lose their place in the nation, their power, their authority, their influence. And because the Romans were a very oppressive government already, but they were willing to allow the local Jewish officials to be in charge of their religious things, as long as it didn't become a disturbance, a riot, a mob, or an insurrection. So they had many things they were concerned about. They were focused so on this their mission to get rid of the one man they felt threatened their place in the nation. And so they are willing, now they're going to start breaking a multitude of Jewish laws. They're going to look for loopholes in the law. They're going to manipulate the law so that they can carry out what they want to do from the very beginning, which is to kill Jesus. They see that as the only alternative they have to solving their problem. And if you think about it, a lot of murders are committed with this idea in mind. If I can just get rid of this individual, it will solve my problems. And of course, the murder only leads to many, many other problems in most cases. So they're going to, of course, bring down destruction on their entire nation because of what they're doing here. But they don't see that at this point. They feel that they must do this. They have the authority and influence to use in order to carry it out, and they're going to do it secretly, and they're going to do it very deceptively so that it looks like they're doing the right things, but accomplishing their evil deeds in the end, which is to have Jesus killed. We will get more into that in the next lesson when we get into the trials that they carry. Jesus has to go through 3 separate trials, at least that's what you can kind of call them, where he meets with 3 different groups before he's taken to Pilate. And then we know that Pilate sends him to Herod, and so the Roman government gets involved. But at the beginning, he goes to 3 separate sections of the Jewish leaders. He's going to go to Annas, A-N-N-A-S, Annas' house, who was a high priest. And he's going to question him and interrogate him. And then he's going to go to the home of Caiaphas, who was the official high priest. He will be interrogated and questioned by him. And then finally, they're going to convene the Sanhedrin Council at daybreak to make it official, because they were not allowed to hold trials at night. They were not allowed to hold a trial on the eve of the Passover or have a trial at the eve of the Passover. And they were not allowed to be involved in any kind of bribery, which of course we know they were when they gave Judas the 30 pieces of silver. So that's just a few of some of the laws that they're going to break in the next few hours. They're going to justify it. They're going to make it look like it's legal. And they're going to twist and manipulate the laws because they have the ability to do so, being the ones in power, in order to carry out their mission, which of course is to get rid of Jesus. Notice that Jesus was arrested without them citing a charge. We're arresting you because, which was customarily what happened when you arrested someone, they had already been convicted of a crime. And then you go and you arrest the individual. The 2 thieves on the cross, I'm sure, were arrested in that way. They committed the crime, then they were found guilty, then they were arrested. In Jesus's case, we have none of that. No crime is charged against Jesus at this point in time. They didn't have one. And they're going to have to come up with one in the next couple hours to make the arrest legal, which involves false witnesses. It involves the twisting of what Jesus says in order to come up with what they call a legitimate reason for arresting Jesus. But the night he was arrested here in the garden, they make no claim to any crime that Jesus has committed. He's not charged verbally or officially with any crime at this point. We will see in next week's lesson, they do come up with a crime, as they call it, that Jesus committed, even though he did not. But they make that charge in order to make their arrest legal. Because as I mentioned, if any of these actions that they do create a problem among the people, the Romans are going to get involved, and that will lead to other problems they don't want to deal with. So they have to keep this all under wraps, as we say, or behind the scenes, so that the Roman officials don't gather what they're up to. Okay, let's go into our true and false questions. The apostles were told never to take purse nor script with them. This is false. In verse 36, he does tell them that's exactly what you're going to need to prepare to do now. Number two, this was the first time Jesus had ever gone to the Mount of Olives. This is also false. In verse 39, it tells us that he often went there. He was accustomed anyway. And on the other accounts, it's also mentioned that Jesus was familiar with this area. Number three, Jesus told the disciples to pray that they enter not into temptation. This is true. Prayer is one of our most powerful weapons against falling into the trap of temptation by Satan. If we are drawing near to God, we are told that Satan will flee from us. So this is why Jesus gives his disciples that instruction. And they will remember these instructions later when they are again faced with personal persecution. Number four, those who came to arrest Jesus carried swords. This is true. Verse 52 tells us that. In some of the other accounts, they brought clubs, they brought torches. It was dark. They had lanterns. They needed to be able to see and give light to what they were doing. And there was a large company of soldiers. We don't know how many in a detachment, but I would guess at least 10 or 12 who also were carrying weapons. And then they had the people bringing the lighting, the torches and so on, because there was no light in the garden. I'm sure it was very, very dark there. Number four, those who came to arrest Jesus carried swords. We've already answered that one. True. Number five, they had once before arrested Jesus while he taught in the temple. This is false. Jesus says that in verse 53. He asks them, why didn't you do it then? But it made more sense. And arrests were to be done in daylight. They were not to do these kinds of things in darkness because it gives the appearance of something they're trying to do in a conspiracy, or to keep it secret for some rate makes it look suspicious. But they were willing to risk that because they thought they could get the conviction and the thing handled before daylight. All right, research question says to read Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and John 13, which are the same accounts of this prediction of Peter's denial. Peter would deny the Lord thrice, meaning 3 times, before the cock crowed how many times? Okay. It doesn't indicate that it was more than one crowing unless you read Mark chapter 14, and Mark says that it will crow twice. So as we know, roosters crow at the beginning of the day, just as the sun's beginning to rise, sometimes even just before the sun rises. These birds have an instinctive ability to know that daylight is about to break, and they begin crowing. I know if you've been around any place where there are roosters, you know that this is a common thing. And they crow more than once. They crow several times to announce that the sun is rising. And that's the way they do. So it could have been more than once, but the first crowing would have been the signal for Peter to remember the words of Jesus. Question 2 there under research, who did Jesus take with him to pray? We talked about that earlier. It was Peter, James, and John, the same 3 disciples that he often gave special assignments to or missions. We know these 3 were with him on the Mount Transfiguration. They were the ones sent into the village to prepare for the supper. They had a lot of separate duties that they performed. We know that in the book of Acts, Peter becomes one of the more prominent apostles. We know that John also is very influential apostle. He's one that lives the longest. And he, of course, wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the book of Revelation, where Peter, as we know, wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. And he also influenced the writing of the book of Mark, because we know that Mark and he were very close. So it is commonly understood that Mark is writing the eyewitness account of Peter in his gospel. Number 3, How many times did Jesus repeat this prayer in the Garden of Eden? And we know that from the other readings, Matthew, Mark, and John, it was 3 times. Luke doesn't record that it was 3 times. Perhaps didn't feel that that was important for Theophilus, who is the person he's writing to know that. Only that Jesus did pray this prayer. But 3 times praying the same prayer always indicates how much this situation is on your mind. If you've ever prayed over and over for something, it's because it's pressing on your mind. It's something you're very troubled about. And so you pray repeatedly for help in that situation, as did Jesus at this account. All right, thought question asks in Luke 22:36-38, they were told to buy a sword. And when informed that they had 2 swords among them, Jesus says it is enough. Now, you're to reconcile this with John 18 and verse 36. So let's go to John chapter 18 and read that verse so we're aware of what we're comparing here. All right, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. So it was not the purpose or intent of the swords to be used to prevent Jesus from being arrested, to prevent him from carrying out his Father's will. As I said, Peter had the sword. It was instinctive for him to want to protect the person that he loved very deeply. And so he acted without understanding. And that's why he suffers no repercussion other than to be told to put the sword away, because that was not the purpose of why he wanted them to carry the sword. The swords were to be used for protection, mostly while they were traveling. It was not to be used in places of violence. They were not to harm anyone with the sword, but just simply use it as a matter of protection. If a robber were to approach them on the road and they had a sword to defend themselves, that would discourage somebody from bothering them. But they were not to seek out those kinds of opportunities. He says another place in Scripture that if you live by the sword, which means a life of violence, you will die by it in a violent way. And that's, of course, when we are that kind of an individual where we're violent and we seek to harm others, more than likely we're going to have it come back upon our heads. They were to use the sword for protection, but not to prevent them from arresting Jesus. The use for the sword would come later. They were to carry it with them as a means of protection, and perhaps also to kill things to eat. They were going to have to maybe do some hunting, and the sword would be useful for that as well. So there were many uses of a sword, and we have to remember that possessing a sword and using it in battle are 2 different things. The swords can be used to cut other things, not just to attack people. So that's how I reconcile this scripture. Jesus's kingdom, of course, is not a physical kingdom. There was no need for any kind of physical defense to be put up for Jesus. He could again have called out 12 legions of angels if he wanted to. He could have at any time prevented any of these things from happening to him if that was what was intended. But he knew that it was the Lord's will, God's will, that he go through and suffer these things. And he was to be treated as a criminal. That is also prophecy, because that shows us the intensity of these men's hatred and the evil thoughts of their heart toward Jesus. Jesus was abused as a prisoner, which was against Jewish law. It's not against Roman law, but it's against Jewish law to strike a prisoner, to do something to them. And Jesus, of course, as we know, next week we're going to study how he is very, very much abused while he's in custody. All right, I hope that that lesson was helpful and edifying and uplifting to you. The next 4 lessons we have left, I do encourage you to read all the gospel accounts of all of these events, because each gospel writer adds an element or detail that helps us get the full and complete picture of what is going to happen to Christ, and helps us to come to a fuller understanding of the degree of suffering and anguish that Christ was willing to do for us, so that we can have forgiveness of sins. I thank you for watching. We will not see one another in person, but I will hopefully see you tune in at the next presentation. Thank you.